Welcome to Jewish Culture in Sweden. I'm Sandy Braworski. I'm a journalist in New York and had the pleasure of joining you for an international conference in Stockholm on Jewish New York just a few years ago. I'm really pleased to be here with Judy Batalion for the Swedish launch of her groundbreaking new book, The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos. The book became an international bestseller soon after its publication. Judy shares the stories of women of astonishing courage who resisted the Nazis. They were not behind the scenes, but front and center. Some, but not all, lived to tell their stories. Thanks to Judy's deep research, we know their names and their accomplishments and how many of their lives linked together. These are life stories that are unforgettable, heartbreaking, inspiring, and really critical for the historical record. Moreover, Judy's book is really beautifully written. It has been getting a lot of attention, and Steven Spielberg is going to be making a film version. So more about that later. We're going to talk about the details of these stories, like how a young Jewish woman covertly worked for the Gestapo, and about why so many of us haven't heard these stories before. So the format is that I'm going to briefly introduce Judy, and then we're going to have a conversation. So by way of introduction, Judy Batalion was born and raised in Montreal, where she grew up speaking English, French, Yiddish, and Hebrew. She did her undergraduate work at Harvard and received her PhD in art history from the University of London. She's the author of a memoir, White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. The multi-talented Judy has worked as a university lecturer, museum curator, stand-up comic, MC, storyteller, actor, Yiddish street performer, and talking head for TV, radio, and podcasts. So she joins us from her home in New York City. So welcome, Judy. I really love your book. And although I read it some months ago, I just keep thinking about the stories of these women. So I thought we'd start at the very beginning, more than a decade ago, about how you first learned of these heroic people.
Sure. First of all, I wanted to say I'm delighted to be here with you and with all you viewers today to celebrate the Swedish launch of this book. This book, which began for me 14 years ago, and actually began completely by accident. I was living in London actually at the time, and I was thinking a lot about my Jewish identity. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I was thinking about what I always call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma trickles over generations. I'm a very anxious person. And it was a time in my life where everything felt very dangerous to me. And I began to wonder how much my Holocaust heritage was shaping how I perceived, even how I reacted to everyday threats, to everyday danger. And at the time I was doing a lot of performing. I used to do stand-up, as you said, and I decided to write a performance piece about this, about danger. And I wanted it to have a historical kind of backbone. I wanted to write about strong Jewish women who had confronted danger. And the first one, really the only one to come to my mind, was a woman named Hannah Senesh, who I had studied back in 5th grade. Right. And for those who don't know, Hannah Senesh was a Hungarian Jew. She was very young, and she made Aliyah. She moved to what was then Palestine in the 1930s. She was a poet, a lyricist. You probably have heard some of her songs. But during World War II, Hannah Senesh decided she wanted to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper, and she volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight the Nazis. She was caught very early on, but legend has it she looked her executioners in the eye when they shot her. I grew up with Hannah Senesh as a symbol, really, of Jewish courage. But back in 2007, 14 years ago, I wasn't interested in Hannah Senesh as a symbol. I wanted to understand Hannah Senesh, the person, who does that? Who chooses to go fight the Nazis? Who what poet decides to jump out of airplanes? I wanted to understand the psychology behind this. What motivates this kind of audacity, this courage, this conviction? I wanted to understand her mind. And so I sought a more nuanced biography of Hannah Senesh. And this led me to the British Library, where I looked up Hannah Senesh. In the catalogs, there were not very many books about Hannah Senesh. So I just ordered whatever they had. And when I got my stack of books from the counter, I noticed that one of the books was a little unusual. It was an old book with dusty pages and a blue fabric cover with gold embossed writing. And it was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I start flipping through this book, curious about this object, curious about this, looking for Hannah Senesh, and I actually can't find her. It turns out she's only in the last few pages. And in front of her, there's 170, 180 pages of stories by and about other young Jewish women who fought the Nazis, and primarily from the ghettos in Poland, with chapter titles like Ammunition, Weapons, Partisan Combat. These were stories of young Jewish women who ran soup kitchens and underground schools and performances and secret printing presses, but also shot Gestapo men in the head and blew up Nazi supply trains and were ghetto fighters who were, part of ghetto uprisings, flinging Molotov cocktails and exploding Nazi tanks. And I'd never come across anything like this in content, in tone. These stories just blew me away. And that was my very long answer to your question of how this all began. That was the beginning.
Why is it that we've never heard of them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a question that really underpin a lot of my research. On the one hand, what happened? What's the story? And on the other hand, what happened to this story? How is it possible that I, from a family of survivors who studied women's history, had no idea about this such a dramatic tale of, and in the end, it turned out hundreds, if not thousands, of women were involved. So how is that even possible? And I at one point, I called my editor and I said, I think the story of the story needs to be the whole book. She did not let me do that. But towards the end of the book, I do have a longer section where I think about the narratives of the Holocaust and what came to be known and what wasn't known. And I think in this story, there are two narratives that have been suppressed. One of them is Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, in particular in Poland. And the other one is women's experience in the Holocaust. And my book is about both of those. And these stories have been silenced for, again, many reasons, which I could talk about for 3 hours, so I won't right now, but I write more about it. Some of it is political. Literally, the story of the Holocaust has been shaped by politics and different politics in different countries. Something we've seen even more recently in Poland, where there's people can only speak about the Holocaust in certain ways. There's attempts to pass laws around that. Some of it has to do with the zeitgeist and what we've been interested in, what we've been uncomfortable discussing, and that's also shifted over the decades. And a lot of it really comes down to the personal. And so women didn't tell this story. They either told it and then stopped, or they didn't tell it until much later in their lives. And sometimes it was because they were not believed. Sometimes it was because they were accused. And I heard this all the time. There was this sort of sense that, the pure souls perished in the Holocaust. But if you lived, it's because you did something. You did something conniving, or you were a collaborator. Some women were accused of sleeping their way to safety. They were accused of leaving their families to fight instead of staying to help their parents. Many of them felt a very, very, really a tremendous survivor's guilt. One woman, Judy Batalion, not only her family was murdered, she was part of an underground ring in Bialystok. These women got weapons, they transported them into the ghetto, they transported them into the forest, they started a league of anti-fascist Germans and connected them with the Red Army, brought weapons from one to the other, did intelligence missions, helped liberate Bialystok. She has an incredible story. And she felt that compared to her survivor peers who had lived through Auschwitz or other camps, that she hadn't had it that bad. She felt that she almost didn't merit telling the story. Certainly not until late in her life. And then as well, and this will be my final thing, for many of these women, I write about women who were in the underground. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. When the war was over, they had those who survived had their entire lives ahead of them. They had no family, no home, they didn't even have a nationality. They were refugees in new countries where they often didn't speak the language. And it was very important for many of them to start fresh, to start new. And they were women, they felt this kind of cosmic need to repopulate the Jewish people, to have children. And they wanted to raise their children in normal, happy environments. And because of that, many of them did not tell their story.
Sorry. They were, some of them were so young. They were really almost girls. And they had amazing confidence and courage and abilities to just sort of walk with a certain gait in and out of the ghetto and not be noticed. Where did that strength come from?
That is a great question. And, as I said earlier, I'm interested in the psychological, what motivates this courage? How did Hannah Senesh do that? So this is a question I've thought about a lot. Where did this strength come from? And I have, as you can imagine, I have several answers to this question, but I'll try to condense for now. And so two important things. Some of it came from their training. These women were part of the Polish Jewish youth movement culture. 100,000 young Polish Jews, a huge number, were part of the youth movements in Poland in the 1930s. And these youth movements, they were like the Scouts, but I would say more so. They were intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual training grounds for young Jews. And they were often aligned either with political parties or political stances. They were value driven. So I write about women who were trained in these socialist, secular youth movements. And so they before the war, they learned how to work together. They believed in collaboration, cooperation. They read psychology, psychoanalysis. They talked about their strengths, their weaknesses, how to best collaborate. They believed in equality. These women were leaders in these groups before the war. Women had leadership roles in Poland in the 1930s. They also believed in self-sufficiency, taking responsibility for ourselves, acting for ourselves. They also had they were secular, but great pride in Jewish heritage, in Jewish history, in Jewish culture. So these were value-driven groups that they taught these women, first of all, to be confident leaders, to care about their people. They valued social work and activity and mutual and aid, refugee aid, helping aid, help for the poor. They were charity organizations as well. And they knew how to work together. They were trained to analyze, to act, to plot and think and act. And I think for a lot of them, their training in these youth movements, especially as leaders of the youth movements, really shaped how they reacted during the war. And I should say, for those who haven't read the book, that it was these youth groups from these youth movements that became the underground in many of these ghettos. I have other reasons as well, but I don't know if I'm going on too long, Sandy.
No, you're great, Judy. I love your enthusiasm and passion for the subject. I thought it'd be great to get a little more specific. And I feel like one of the characters that you're really drawn to and maybe feel a real connection to is Renya. Can you maybe take us through her life story and the kinds of things that she was involved with?
Sure. Renia Kukielkow is sort of the central figure in my book. She was very young when the war started. She was about 15, and her family was, imprisoned in a ghetto, but she was defiant from the start. She used to sneak out of the ghetto and try to sell family heirlooms for bits of food to try to help feed her family. In 1942, her family knew they were going to be killed. And they took whatever money they had, they split it up, and they escaped the ghetto in their town, Jens-Dehov. And Renya went alone. And she looked good. This is what they call it. She could pass for being Christian. She was a bit lighter skinned, lighter toned. And so she first tried to find her brother in a camp. She was almost killed. She got on a train to try to find someone from her town, recognized her. She knew she was in trouble. She picked up her bag, walked to the end of the train to a little platform, and jumped off a moving train. She tried to find hiding spots. She got a job working as a housemaid for a German family, passing as being Polish. But she really missed her sister, her family, and she tried to connect. She found a way to connect with her older sister, and her sister smuggled her to this town of Bijin. At this point, Renya was 18, and her sister was involved with the underground. Her sister's name was Sarah, and Sarah was involved with the underground in Bijin. And at that time, they were trying to plan an uprising. And their headquarters was in Warsaw, the underground, but all the couriers who had been going back and forth had been killed, and they had no new information from Warsaw. And Renya, because she looked good, she could pass, they asked her, though she had no experience at all in this, if she could be what they called a courier girl. And she immediately agreed, yes, of course I'll do it. And so she became a courier girl. In Hebrew, the term is kashayot, connector. These were young Jewish women like Renya, 18, 19 years old, who pretended to be Christian and as such slipped in and out of ghettos, connecting Jewish communities. They brought news. Jews were not allowed to have newspapers. They were not allowed to have radios. It was often young Jewish women bringing news. They were the ones bringing the news of the Nazi genocide, of these killings. It was young women bringing the reports. They brought news, they brought information, they brought bulletins, they brought money. They were also often the ones to arm the ghetto underground. They met with weapons dealers. They purchased guns, explosives. Renya bought even ammunition and bombs and would tape them to their torsos, put them in fashionable handbags, and bring them back into the ghettos. They also helped rescue people, take Jews out of ghettos, out of camps, and find them safe hiding spots in the cities. So that was the work she was involved in 1943 until she got caught. And then I don't want to tell you the rest of the story. Then you have to buy the book and read the rest of
it. Thanks, Judy. So some of them came from religious backgrounds. I wonder if that sort of faith helped them and if it was problematic for them to pose as Christians when they were able to.
That's a really good question. So though some of them did come from religious families, I'm writing about women in the socialist secular youth movements. So most of them had, I don't want to say abandoned religion, but they'd moved away from their religious identity already. Many of these youth movements, I didn't even say before, these young Jews would leave their family home and move in to communes. They were kibbutzim. I had no idea about this. They were all over Poland, and they would move in. Often the parents were very upset about this, especially in religious families, because their children were moving into these secular communes without them. And so many of the women had left their religious upbringing before joining these movements, so before the war. I think anyone who could pass was willing to pass. Many of them, they dressed up. There are many stories of the details of dyeing their hair, washing their face with certain soaps, certainly finding the right clothing, the right skirt, the right shirt. They also had to have a particular identity. Sometimes they were dressing up as peasant girls. That was part of the ruse. So they had to find peasant clothes. Sometimes they needed to be out and about in Warsaw. And so they had to dress up as an upper middle class young woman who was out, for a day of theater or shopping, when really she was bringing Jews to hiding spots. But it depended on what role they were playing and what they were doing. There's a lot of discussion on exactly how they costumed themselves for this performance.
You have some wonderful photos. I wonder first, how did you track down the photos? And maybe you can show us a few of them.
Yes, I loved finding the photos, and the photos come from a selection of archives in Poland and in Israel. Many of them are from archives in Israel, and a few from the museum in DC, the Holocaust Museum here in the US. And I could have included 2,000 photos in the book. I did not, but there are a number of these photographs are in the book as well. There are about 35 photos in the book. And sure, I will show you a few of them. So this first photo is one of Frumka Plotnicka. She is the second one on the right. She's wearing a thick fur collar. Frumka, this photo was taken in Białystok in 1938. This was before the war. Frumka was already, as I said, a leader in the Jewish youth movements in Poland before the war. And this photo is of a group from her youth movement. When Hitler invaded Warsaw, she fled east along with many of the members of these youth movements. In fact, that's how my grandparents went as well and survived. And she actually found herself in what was then safe territory near her parents' home in Pinsk. But she couldn't take it. She couldn't take having fled. She was, I should say, about 25 at the time. And so she was the first one. She smuggled herself back into Nazi-occupied Poland. She went to Warsaw. She became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. She was known as Die Mame, the mother, in Yiddish. She, ran soup kitchens for hundreds of Jews. She negotiated with Polish, Jewish, German leaders and government. She ran seminars and performances and teaching in schools. She also realized it wasn't just Warsaw. So she put on she did have very Jewish features. It's written about all the time, but she put a handkerchief over her, a scarf over her face and makeup. And she slipped out of the ghetto and traveled through the country, giving seminars and lectures in different ghettos in Poland. She also collected information. She was bringing information to Jewish communities about the executions and mass executions that were going on in the country. She was one of the first people to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. She brought 2 guns in a sack of potatoes. She was then stationed in this town of Bijin, where she ran the underground. And I don't want to give too much away, but she was killed. Frumka was killed while shooting from a bunker, shooting Nazis. And after the war, she was actually awarded a medal from the then active Polish government for her military service. Wow. And we've totally, I'd never heard of Frumka Plotnicka. She always makes me a little verklempt because I really feel like I felt such a part of it. I felt such a duty to tell her story. I always if I don't tell her story, who will? And almost feel like a granddaughter she was never able to have.
So thank you for telling her story and for all of these stories. Amazing.
Thank you for reading them. This is should I show more photos?
Yeah, let's see a couple more.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite photos, also in the book. And this is three women. The one in the middle is, bottom in the middle is, her name is Bella Hazan. Bella was in the underground from the movement, from the get-go of the war, no question. She was actually early on stationed. They wanted her to live on the outside. So some women sort of lived in the ghetto and did work from the ghetto, like Frumka, but Bella, she wasn't even that Aryan looking, but she was, such a courageous, strong person with a slightly Slavic look. And they said, they wanted her to live completely on the outside. They asked her to move to this town of Grodno to do work from there. And the women that had to live on the outside, they talk about this, they were doing an acting job, life or death acting job, 24/7. It was acting with no intermission, one of them said. And so she had to find an apartment. She had to find a job because that would be unusual to have a single woman, she also needed money. So she went to the Grodno, the town's employment office, and, and she needed a job. They said, we have the perfect job for you. You can work at the Gestapo. And so she gets a job as a receptionist, translator. She brings them tea in the Gestapo office in Grodno. And from this job, she also she steals their documents. So she steals travel papers, visas, any kind of stamps she can find for Aryan papers. And she brings these to these makeshift Jewish forgery labs in the ghetto so they can make fake IDs for members of the underground, for Jews, for travel papers, So she brings them these papers. She also starts smuggling guns and she's an amazing career. But one of the men, I'll come back to this photo. So there's a whole story. So one of the men in the Gestapo office, one of the officers, develops a crush on her. And he invites her to the Gestapo Christmas party. And again, she can't say no because this would be suspect. Nothing can ever be suspect. Everything has to just go with the flow and be unnoticed. So of course she says, I'd love to come. And that night, it happens that two other Jewish couriers here in the photo, Tama Schneiderman and Lanka Kazabrodska, are staying in her room while they're on their missions across the country. And so there's a pretense that they're her cousins, so she has to bring them as well to the Gestapo Christmas party. So this is a picture of three Jewish underground operatives taken at the Gestapo Christmas party in Grodno in 1941. And this photo actually ends up getting her caught later on. But again, you can read the story in the book. I won't blabber about it now, but yeah.
What a photo. They're very beautiful. Just to get back to the book, Judy, what was the process of writing it like? You had so much information. You've got pages and pages of footnotes and all of these stories. How did you put it together? You create a beautiful narrative out of all this.
I don't know. It was, thank you. It was very, very difficult. It was difficult because I wasn't just putting together the story of Jewish women in the underground. I was putting together really the whole story of the Jewish resistance in Poland. There hasn't been really any overall book that timelines or provides a chronological narrative of the Jewish underground in Poland. There are amazing books. There are biographies, case studies of certain ghettos, encyclopedic entries. I could never have done this book without them. But there's no book that really put together the whole story of resistance. So that was very hard for me. I was working from diaries. I was working from primary source documents with hundreds and hundreds of names. And I was trying to create a chronology. One of my early drafts was literally this happened. Oh, then this happened. Then this happened. Then oh, that story. Oh, that's the same story she's telling. That's the same story. That's the same. So even just figuring out what the narrative is of the Jewish underground in Poland took me a long time. It was complicated to put together, definitely.
Now, you've got 2 volumes behind us. Tell us the difference between the blue and the red.
Yeah, so these are the American editions of the book. Because of the pandemic, I haven't received all the foreign editions. So I don't have the Swedish one yet, but the American edition, there's a red and a blue. And the red one is the adult version of the book. And the blue one is for children. It's actually intended for ages 10 to 14, 10 to 15. And it is the young reader's edition of the book, which was actually my publisher's idea to create. I worked with someone who specializes in writing for that age group. But they approached me and said, would you like to do something for young people? And, it struck me when I told you this whole project began because I was interested in Hannah Senish, who I had studied in 5th grade. And I'd remembered her all those decades later. And it just felt like such an important time to share this story, such an important age, so much impact from these stories. So of course I was very, very eager to do it. And so it's shorter, it's more narrative. It doesn't have as much background information and discussion around Polish history. But it's the same kishkes. It's the same guts, really.
Great that you did it. Judy, tell us about the kind of travel that you did in doing your research.
I traveled primarily. I was working. My book is only about Poland. I had to. It was so much even Poland, but I had to. I limited it to Poland, and so I spent time in Poland. And then in Israel, where both a number of the survivors went and where there are a number of archives specifically dedicated to ghetto fighters. And also I traveled around North America, again, visiting families. So part of the research was archival, finding whatever testimonies, documents, photographs, ephemera, letters that I could find. Some of it was environmental, almost. In particular in Poland, I wanted to go see these places, even though so much of Poland has been rebuilt. A lot of it still actually is. There are pre-war. The town of Beijing, where a lot of this takes place, is still exists. And it's interesting because in all these diaries, all these testimonies I read about Beijing, I had no idea that the town was on a hill. No one mentioned that. And then when I went there, I thought, oh, this whole town is like that. It's on a slope. And, that just things like that just shifted my understanding, they helped the storytelling. I wanted to sit on a train between Warsaw and Krakow, even though the trains obviously are not the same as they were in the 40s, but just to get a sense of what were they seeing out the window? How long is that train ride? While they were pretending to be Christian, I wanted to experience walking in their shoes as much as I could. So some of the travel was that.
The book really has that flavor of that firsthand observations. What was it like to meet the families? And can you generalize, did these people's heroism continue throughout their lives? Those who were lucky enough to survive, of course.
I was going to say the other reason to travel was to meet their families. And, I write about many people. I met with over 20 families. So they're all a little different. Most of them were very happy that I was writing about this. Did their heroism continue? That's a really good question. And many of these women who survived were very compassionate people. And many of them went on to have caring careers, nurses, teachers, health aides, refugee aid, social workers, humanitarian work. Some of them were leaders in their communities. They ran kibbutzim. And some of them went into government. There was a minister in Israel who had been one of the ghetto fighters. So yes, many of them did continue in some form of social and social work, social help. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And was the title of the book always clear to you from the beginning?
Absolutely not. It was so hard to find a title for this book. Everything I suggested was rejected immediately. And we were actually having a lot of trouble finding a title. And my editor and I think it was her idea to look at poetry, to look at songs, to see if we could find something that resonated from poetry. And of course, we thought Hannah Senish was a poet. We started looking at her work and other work. And then I remembered that original Yiddish book that I had found in the British Library had some songs in it and had some poems in it. So I went back and translated those and sent those around. And one of them was a song, lyrics for a song written by a young Jewish girl who was, and it was a winner of a song competition. And it was inspired by an uprising. It was about Warsaw, and it's a Warsaw, might be destroyed right now, but don't worry, one day again, it will still see the light of days.
Wow.
And so that felt dark, but inspiring. And so that's stuck. And then I should say at the same time, I was also thinking about this. Many of the women were in the underground, of course, but they were literally underground. And they write a lot about feeling hungry and feeling thirsty, but they also write about literally craving the light of days. They weren't able to go outside during the day for large parts of the war. And that was moving to me too. So I don't know, the light of the days feels like a privilege somehow. And
yeah, it's a beautiful title. I wonder if in these last months of the pandemic, whether these stories have given you some inspiration.
Yes. I mean, it's, as I said before, these women were so compassionate, and even the war was barely over. They were barely liberated, and someone like Zivia Lebekin was already creating safe houses for Jews in Poland. We're talking in 1945, and trying to help refugees and trying to help Jews find their families and barely minutes after being liberated from the war. They were so, they were so giving, and it inspired me to try to focus on ways that maybe I can give or help rather than suffer, which, we've all experienced during this pandemic. But it's, I've tried to hold them in my head as really figures of not just, fighting Nazis, but really compassionate people who help me appreciate what I do have.
And is there a message that you would like readers to take away?
I mean, there are probably many messages, but I think there are two maybe important messages. Ultimately, and one is a more perhaps intellectual, and it's this idea that there's been a great myth of Jewish passivity in World War II, in the Holocaust, and it's just simply not true. I mean, now I too had imbibed this myth, which is why finding that Yiddish book shocked me. But now when I look at the story of the Jews, and certainly the Jews of Poland, this is a story of not just passivity, this is a story of constant activity and struggle and defiance and rebellion and constant resistance. Just people were killed because they were being oppressed by a brutal, sadistic military force. But this was a story of constant action and passion and activity. And along those lines, these Jewish women that I write about, I mean, they had nothing. They were starving. They didn't have drink. They didn't have light. So I just said they did nothing. And they knew they weren't going to topple the Nazis. They used to joke that their whole weapons cache fit in a bicycle basket. And that didn't matter. They still went out there. They still risked their lives time and time again in the fight for justice, for liberty, for what they knew and felt was right. And they, their acts, their small acts, they mattered. They mattered to them. They mattered to the people around them. And they matter to me. And I think to us generations later. And these small acts are what lead to hopefully great change. So I think that's, the message is you do what you can in whatever way you can.
Thanks. We're almost out of time. I don't know, a couple more things. Is it too early? Can you tell us anything about the possible film version?
It is a bit early. We've been working on a screenplay, which I am co-writing. But it's drafts and drafts and things. So I don't have much to say at this stage, but we're hoping that.
And is there another book that you're working on now?
Oh, that's the difficult question. I'm working on a few things. One of them is totally different. It's like I needed to get away from the material. It was so difficult. So some of it's much lighter writing. And then there's another project that I just might be starting that harks back to some of this research. But I don't feel like I can say yet. I need to sit on that a little bit before I can say anything.
So good luck with all of that. I just want to say the book is also, it's really timely reading for this time of year, and the themes of the holidays and renewal and resilience. So much of that really echoes through the book. Judy, I want to thank you so much for bringing these women's stories to life, and for your insight and compassion and candor and passion. I really recommend the book, The Light of Days, which you can now find in bookstores in Sweden and online. The publisher is Culture. Forgive me if I mispronounced that. And thank you all very much for watching Jewish Culture in Sweden. And I want to wish you all a very sweet and healthy new year. And let's hope this is a year of peace. So thank you. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you so much. And sei gesund.
Sei gesund.